If you're drafting a fantasy football team soon, this video will help you because we're ranking the top 24 overall players for fantasy, those first 2 to 3 rounds of your draft where you can't afford to mess up that pick. Now, if you're not familiar, I'm Sal Vetcher. I've been helping people win their fantasy leagues for the past 8 years, and I plan to do the same for you in this video. And let's start it off right away with some of the players in tier 1. We're going to break this down by tiers. Here's a couple of the players in tier 1, our top tier S up top, as you can see right there. And we're going to start with Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley, who you all know had one of the best running back seasons of all time last year. So much so that he was the RB1 overall in the season in his first year with the Eagles, putting up over 22 fantasy points per game, and basically every single metric that matters last year, Saquon was the leader. In carries, 21.6 per game. By the way, he played all 17 games. He was number 2 in red zone touches. He led the NFL in breakaway run rates. He had the most rushing yards with over 2,000. Every single metric he dominated. And in terms of how explosive he was behind this number 1 ranked offensive line in the number 1 ranked rush offense, we've showed you this stat before if you're a loyal viewer, but Saquon Barkley last year had the most runs of 10 plus, 20 plus, 30 plus, 40 plus, 50 plus, 60 plus yards. He did everything you want from a fantasy running back. He got the red zone carries behind a great offensive line, and he broke off explosive plays left and right. So Saquon's my number 1 overall player, but as you can see here, we have a tier. We have a tier with number 2 Bijan Robinson and number 3 Jamar Chase, which means that if you wanted to take those guys ahead of Saquon, I'm fine with that. They're in the same tier. It just depends on the strategy or the play type you're looking for. Now, specifically with Bijan Robinson, this was a guy last year who was the RB3 in fantasy points per game, but it was a different story towards the second half of the season when he separated from Tyler Algier and became the RB1 overall in fantasy during the second half of the year. And during that time, Bijan Robinson led every single running back in yards created. He was creating on his own, independent of his offensive line, 82 yards per game, almost 1,400 yards created on his own. He got no help from his offensive line. Imagine if Bijan Robinson was behind the Saquon Barkley Eagles offensive line, he might have went for over 2,000 yards. And now he's entering year 3. He's a younger player who maybe doesn't have as much injury risk as a Saquon Barkley. If you wanted to weigh those things against each other, I understand the argument, although I don't completely agree with it because it's not like Saquon's 31 years old. And the reason I have Bijan number 2 and Saquon number 1 is Bijan does have a little bit of risk here with a new quarterback in Michael Penix, but in those 3 games where Michael Penix ended the year last year as a starter, Bijan averages almost 27 fantasy points per game with over 115 rushing yards per game. Now that's just a small 3-game sample. They were leaning run heavy in some nice matchups during that time. They also had some games that went into overtime, so it's a little bit skewed here, but he did have success. The concern would be that if that was just a glimpse for Michael Penix at the end of the year against worse defenses, that maybe he's not going to be that way all year long, and if he's not as good, well, it could hurt the whole offense. But certainly Bijan has RB1 overall upside, and Jamar Chase, we saw it last year, he has wide receiver 1 overall upside and just the number 1 overall player in fantasy upside because, like we said, this dude did it literally last year when he led the NFL with 175 targets, over 10 targets per game. Not only did he lead the NFL in targets, he led it in every other category. He won the Triple Crown. He led it in receptions with 127, receiving yards with over 1,700. Oh yeah, he also had 17 touchdowns, and he led basically everything in terms of red zone usage, downfield usage, yards after the catch. He was number 1 in all these categories, or number 2. We don't have to spend too much time on how great Jamar Chase is, but as you can see right here, he basically every year has been consistent. The wide receiver 1 overall last year, top 5 this a couple years before that. The year before that, he dealt with some injuries, was still a wide receiver 1 in fantasy, and now the Bengals are returning everybody. Joe Burrow, T. Higgins is there, so there won't be as much defensive attention only going Jamar Chase's way. Everything should be the same. A defense that doesn't look all that great, so they're going to have to keep throwing to stay up in games or keep up in games. Looks like another strong year for Jamar Chase. Okay, believe it or not, that's all I have in tier 1 because I want to start off tier 2 with these 3 players. We'll start Jahmyr Gibbs, then CeeDee Lamb, then Christian McCaffrey. And we could start with Jahmyr Gibbs because, I mean, this guy was absolutely fantastic last year. He was one of the most dominant running backs in fantasy football. Overall, he was the RB2 in fantasy football, but when David Montgomery wasn't out there, he started to score 30 fantasy points per game. And I mean, in terms of the actual game logs, this is what Jahmyr Gibbs has done the past 2 seasons without David Montgomery. In those 6 games without Montgomery, you can see here, RotoViz, the right side of the screen, 27.4 fantasy points per game. Between his receiving yards of 36 and his rushing yards of about 110 to 111, the dude averages nearly 150 yards per game without David Montgomery. To end last year, he played in about 3 games without Montgomery and had 2 touchdowns in every single game, 150 yards per game. He was just unreal. And I say that because, you know, if David Montgomery misses time, Jahmyr Gibbs to the moon. But even without that, you can see here a training camp report that's coming out. This is courtesy of Top One over on Instagram. Jahmyr Gibbs right now is getting more reps with the first team, as you can see this quote right here, than David Montgomery in the new John Morton offense. It was a 75-25 snap distribution. Now, again, this is only training camp, but it makes sense. New offensive coordinator, you're entering another year for Jahmyr Gibbs, who clearly is the more flashy, dynamic back than another year older David Montgomery, who's coming off of an injury. It could be the year they give Gibbs way more touches. And if that's the case, he's going to break out. And a guy we've already seen break out is my number 5 overall player in tier 2, my wide receiver 2. Yes, my wide receiver 2 in CeeDee Lamb, who was a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy points per game last year. and that doesn't even tell the whole story because he had to deal with an injured Dak Prescott, his own injuries left and right the second half of the season to the shoulder, and Cooper Rush as his quarterback. But despite all that, CeeDee Lamb said, I do not care, and he had 17.6 points per game. The year before that, when Dak was actually healthy, let's not forget, a top 3 fantasy season ever, not just in the last 10 years, ever for a wide receiver with 23.7 fantasy points per game. Back to 2023, the second half of the season when Dak and CeeDee Lamb were locked in, Lamb was averaging 28.5 fantasy points per game, which is number 1 of all time, easily across any position. Now, of course, heading into this year, the Cowboys did make some offseason moves. Early in the offseason, they spent a 4th-round pick to get Jonathan Mingo from the Panthers, and the big move, a 2nd-round pick to go to the Pittsburgh Steelers and get George Pickens overall. So this is not like a situation where I'm too concerned. It's not, I'm not jumping up and down and saying like George Pickens is going to take 150 targets from CeeDee Lamb. No, I think CeeDee Lamb still has 150 target upside. I think Pickens on the outside could have a good year, can have an 8 to 10 touchdown year in general, and can still help CeeDee Lamb just open up more in the middle of the field. So I'm a fan of CeeDee Lamb this year as a top 5 pick, and very close to being a top 5 pick for me is Christian McCaffrey, who's my number 6 pick. I feel comfortable taking him all the way as close to number 4 if you want to, since he's in the same tier as Jahmyr Gibbs. This is a guy who we know is banged up last year, but when healthy, you already know the deal. Because it doesn't take that much effort to look at the last 2 seasons when he was healthy with the RB2 overall finish, and 2023 where he had 24.5 fantasy points per game. He was the RB1 overall. He put up 2,000 total yards in this season between his rushing of nearly 1,500. He had in that year as well, if we look at the touchdowns, 21 total touchdowns, 564 receiving yards, 67 receptions. He was an absolute monster. This is a guy who's in 3 out of his last 4 healthy seasons has had at least 24 fantasy points per game. 24 fantasy points per game last year was more than a point more per game than Saquon Barkley, and we know how good his season was. That's basically just what McCaffrey does more times than not when healthy. And speaking of health right now, McCaffrey's backfield, as of this recording, Jordan James, the rookie, is dealing with injuries. Isaac Horrendo, the second-year player, is dealing with injuries. The only healthy back in this backfield as of this recording in training camp, believe it or not, is Christian McCaffrey. Oh, let's go across to other positions. Brandon Ayuk, they're saying he might get put on the PUP list, and you might not see him until week 5 at the earliest. As of this recording, Juwan Jennings is dealing with a calf injury. Ricky Pearsall just came back from a hamstring injury. So, what are you looking at here? It's like upside down world that Christian McCaffrey's the healthiest 49er, it seems, skill position-wise right now. And let's not take for granted that according to Ian Hartitz on Twitter, he has a chart here of the hardest and easiest schedules. Right now, the 49ers and Christian McCaffrey have the 3rd easiest schedule in the NFL for the running back position. This is already a guy who has been dominating in the past when he's been on bad offenses with bad schedules, like the Carolina Panthers, way back now it seems. Now he's on a good offense with a good schedule. Wheels up for Christian McCaffrey. Now my next player in tier 2 is going to be Justin Jefferson, my number 7 overall player, my wide receiver 3 as of right now. This is a guy who last year nearly averaged 19 fantasy points per game despite having a quote-unquote down year. And it wasn't really a down year, right? It was a down year for what people expected. As you can see right here, he still finished as the wide receiver 3 in fantasy points per game. He just didn't have 20 plus points per game like he did in his previous seasons with Kirk Cousins, but he still had a good year last year with a brand new quarterback in Sam Darnold. This is a guy who had over 100 receptions yet again last year. He had over 1,500 yards yet again. He managed to stay healthy, which he wasn't able to do the year before that. Now, it is worth bringing up that in training camp right now, he's dealing with a hamstring injury. They're calling it mild, and he has 6 weeks until week 1 from when he suffered the injury, so he should be good. That shouldn't be a concern, assuming there's no re-injury. But now, if you look across the 4 seasons where Justin Jefferson has stayed healthy, he's averaged 19.3 fantasy points per game, 1,590 yards, and 107 receptions, obviously as elite as it gets. And this is a guy who's basically quarterback proof because just a couple years ago, he played with Joshua Dobbs and Nick Mullins, and in those games, he averaged 22 fantasy points per game. I mean, you're looking at Sam Darnold last year, he averaged 19 fantasy points per game, so I'm not concerned that basically a rookie, former first-round pick from last year, but he was injured, and J.J. McCarthy, in this Kevin O'Connell offense with a top-tier offensive line, I'm not concerned. I have no reasons to feel why Justin Jefferson can't finish once again as a top 10 overall player in fantasy. All right, now we'll kick off tier 3 of my rankings with my number 8 overall player, and it's Ashton Jeanty, the rookie of the Raiders, the top 10 overall pick in the first round this past year because he's probably the most exciting rookie we've seen come out of the draft since Saquon Barkley. Jonathan Taylor, Bijan Robinson, these were hype prospects, Breece Hall to an extent, but it's Ashton Jeanty and Saquon in the same tier. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Ashton Jeanty, yes, he scored 30 touchdowns last year at Boise State. He was basically their whole team, the reason why they were a ranked team for the most part. Over 2,600 rushing yards. The guy was an absolute monster. And it's not just that. I mean, this is a guy who had 163 missed forced tackles last year. He set the college football record, and he had 43 more than anybody else. Insane. And a lot of people are sleeping on the fact that Ashton Jeanty can catch passes. Right now in camp, you're seeing it right now. Ashton Jeanty as a receiving threat. The rookie Harvey has gotten rave reviews from coaching as a natural catcher through camp. And here's the thing about his overall usage in college, if you look at it, like sure, last year he only had, 23 catches because he was running for 2,600 yards. But the year before that, 43 catches, 569 receiving yards, 13% target share, share. He was like top 5 to top 10 in every running back receiving category. This is a guy who can catch passes. There's a reason they spent the top 10 overall pick on him. He's an explosive runner and a 3-down back. And now he lands on a depth chart, which, you know, he already has a draft capital. He's the starter here, but I'm not concerned about a 32, 33-year-old Raheem Mostert and a bunch of running backs last year on this team who they basically just were never giving touches to because they were like, oh, that guy's not good. Let's try out this next flavor of the week running back the following week, and none of them could stand. You're going to look at Ashton Genty probably getting 300 plus touches this year. Now, this video is going to break down my top 24 overall players, but if you want to see my top 50 overall players completely free, just click the link in the description, or you can head to fantasyrankingsfree.com. That is fantasyrankingsfree.com. And that will take you to this page where you just enter your email, and I'll send you then instantly the top 50 overall rankings. If you don't see it, be sure to check your spam or promotional folders. It will send you the top 50 players ranked and tiered out, just like this video has some tiers, showing you the best and worst picks in every single round, highlighted in green or red. But if you're a serious fantasy player, especially if you have a draft coming up and you want my top 250 overall rankings, all my other drafting tools, and my in-season tools, well, that's why I built the Fantasy Blueprint. It's what I use, and over 10,000 people are currently using for their leagues. You can check it out with the link in the description below, or you can head to jointheblueprint.com. It'll take you to this page where you can learn more. You could also check out all of the other testimonials that are on there right now from a bunch of people who were on the site last year for the Fantasy Blueprint and are now back this year. Which I do want to share that over 85% of people who signed up last year are back for this year. So 9 out of 10 people said, yeah, that was good enough last year that I want to re-up again this year, which kind of just shows you that it's probably a good product that's going to help you schmack around your league mates and make them say, how the heck did this guy get so good? So if you want to get the Fantasy Blueprint before it fills, there's not a lot of spots left. Make sure you go to jointheblueprint.com, or you can click the link in the description below. Again, there's limited spots remaining. So we remain in tier 3 with my number 9 overall player, Derrick Henry, who, look, a lot of people want to talk about age, even though I know he's turning 31 years old, but he's coming off of arguably his probably most explosive season ever. Because not only did Derrick Henry nearly have 2,000 rushing yards last year, he led the NFL in breakaway runs of 10 plus yards. His explosive rating, he was more explosive per touch, believe it or not, than Saquon Barkley. He posted last year in terms of efficiency a career high with 6.1 yards per touch, 5.3 yards per carry, true yards per carry. All these numbers are right around a career high, and it makes sense. He also scored 18 touchdowns. He was on the number 1 rushing offense in the NFL with the Ravens, depending on rushing yards if you want to look at it. Rush attempts was the Eagles. That offense averaged 5.8 yards per carry between the backup running backs Lamar and Derrick Henry. It was the perfect situation, even at age 31, for Henry to succeed. And the best part is he's just going to get to run it back again this year. It's a lot of the same offense coming back, and you can see right here the Ravens are currently projected, according to Hayden Wink's tweet from Vegas Sportsbooks, for the second most points in the entire league per game, 25.2. Only behind the Bills, basically barely. It's a virtual tie, who are at 25.3. So if you want to fade Derrick Henry because of his age, that's fine. It's not something that I'm doing. Like, I'm not getting Derrick Henry in a lot of drafts just because I prefer like Christian McCaffrey, who usually goes after him, or some high-end wide receivers that we've already talked about. But I'm not going to fade him because of his age, because he's proven to already be an outlier, so I'm not concerned. I will give him at least one more year of high production, and so are the sports books projecting for like 13 or 14 touchdowns. Now, in tier 3, our number 10 player is going to be Nico Collins, who was a top 10 wide receiver last year, and the most interesting part about this is Nico Collins might have been the number 1 overall player in fantasy if it wasn't for a hamstring injury in week 5. His first 4 games of the season, 22.7 fantasy points per game. That was more than Saquon Barkley had over the course of the year. 10.8 targets per game, over 122 yards per game. He was doing this with a healthy Stefon Diggs and a healthy Tank Dell, and now Tank Dell's out for the year, and Stefon Diggs is not on the team. He's on the Patriots. You can see those changes here in the subtractions column of the team changes tracker in the Fantasy Blueprint. Again, get it while there's limited spots available at jointheblueprint.com. But no Stefon Diggs. Tank Dell is hurt. What do? They bring in Christian Kirk. Okay, slot wide receiver, probably plays in 3 wide receiver sets, a nice veteran. They bring in Jaden Higgins at the top of the second round. Outside wide receiver, most likely starts there. Outside of that, though, you're talking about a second round rookie and a veteran who's now bounced around to like his 3rd or 4th team in the NFL, and Christian Kirk. Yeah, Nico Collins wheels up. There we go. The competition was tougher last year than this year. So yeah, the freaky 6'4", 215-pound downfield and red zone body in Nico Collins, he might actually see like 160 to 170 plus targets this year. I'm not passing on him or this offense. The next 2 players in my tier 3 are going to be running back Devon Achane, my number 11 player, and Brian Thomas, my number 12 player. Now, as for Achane, this was a guy who was a top 6 running back in fantasy last season, but when Tua Tagovailoa, his quarterback, was healthy, Achane was the running back 1 overall in fantasy, averaging 22.6 points across 11 games. And now if we look at the Dolphins team changes tracker on their subtractions, they lose Raheem Mostert. Okay, that's like 100 touches that are now off the board and will have to be replaced by either Achane or some backups. But more importantly, they lose Jonnu Smith, and that's going to leave 111 targets up for grab. And the reason why this is so important, as you can see Ryan Heat's tweet right here, Jonnu Smith and Devon Achane last year both finished top 15 in design targets. And now you're telling me that Jonnu Smith is gone. So this is an offense that was designing a lot of targets in the short to middle parts of the field. Part of that was because of backup quarterbacks. Part of that is because that's where Tua was just finding success, and the offense was finding success. They were facing a lot of cover 2s, which was taking away the deep plays from Tyreek and Jalen Waddle. Now that was a mouthful and kind of nerdy football talk, but hopefully you appreciated it. The point being is that Achane already led all running backs in receptions last year, and he might even have more targets coming his way without Jonnu this year. And here's another awesome tweet from Wolf of Roto Street. You can see here, Devon Achane has played 22 full games with Tua Tagovailoa. He's hit at least 20 fantasy points in 60% of those games and has scored 23 touchdowns in those 22 games. So he averages over a touchdown per game. He basically finishes like a top 5 running back 60% of the time when Tua is healthy. I want Achane on my teams this year, especially because he goes in like round 2. I think he's a first round type pick. And I also think a first round pick right now, a top 12 overall pick, should be Brian Thomas, because he just produced one of the most efficient and dynamic rookie seasons we've ever seen for a wide receiver after finishing as a top 12 wide receiver overall in fantasy last year and number 3 in receiving yards. And the crazy thing is he was injured, so if you remove like weeks 8 through 11 when he was dealing with injuries, leaving early, not being fully out there, the dude averaged 19 fantasy points per game. So he was a borderline top 5 fantasy receiver, Justin Jefferson type production. And he was just so efficient. As a rookie, top 10 in yards per route run, 2.55 yards per route run. I mean, every single thing you could look at. Yards after the catch, so producing after the catch as well in the short to intermediate parts as well as downfield. He was top 5 in that category. He had explosive plays at every single distance last year. He had 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 yard gains, and he was top 5 in all those categories. And by the way, the second half of the year, a lot of it, he was playing with Mac Jones as his quarterback. But now he doesn't have to play with Mac Jones because Trevor Lawrence will be healthy, and he does get some more competition in Travis Hunter, but Christian Kirk is gone. Evan Ingram are gone. These are guys who were seeing a ton of targets, over 150 combined last year. So even if Travis Hunter comes in and has a nice season, okay, he's just going to take away the production of like Evan Ingram plus Christian Kirk or some combination of that. That's fine. There's still a lot here for Brian Thomas to be a first round fantasy pick. All right, let's finish up my big tier 3 here with a couple of wide receivers. My number 13 overall player, Malik Neighbors, and my number 14 overall player, Puka Nacua. Now we'll start with Malik Neighbors because this is a guy who was the wide receiver 6 in fantasy points last year despite terrible quarterback play. And by the way, he was also a rookie. But the crazy part is he ranked number 1 in expected fantasy points per game. He was expected to score about 24 fantasy points per game. The reason why he didn't was his offense wasn't good. The offensive line wasn't good, so they didn't get to the red zone as much. They weren't giving him accurate targets. So instead, he just finished with a very strong still 18.2 fantasy points per game. This is a guy, though, that overall as a rookie had one of the most impressive seasons we've ever seen. Number 2 in the NFL with 170 targets last year. He had 109 catches, by the way, number 3 in the NFL. I mean, he was just so great. If his offense got to the red zone more, this is probably a guy who could have threatened for double digits, dozen plus touchdowns, and been a top 3 or maybe number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy. His film was insane. He's explosive as heck. And now the hope is, and I would say that it is, on paper, this is a better quarterback situation. They're saying Russell Wilson, no doubt about it, will be the starter to start the season. We'll see if he holds the job as long as he does. There's Jameis, there's Jackson Dart, who's having apparently a nice training camp as of right now. Either way, this is a massive upgrade from what you were getting last year from a combination of, I don't even know, Tommy DeVito, Daniel Jones, bunch of just quarterbacks that you don't want going out there. Drew Lock, I think at one point, not great. So we know the volume's there now, and we might even get a little bit more efficiency for Malik Neighbors. Now, number 14 overall is Puka Nacua, and I wouldn't hate you, right? There's a reason why, like I said, he's in the same tier as Ashton Genty, my number 8 overall player. If you wanted to take Puka Nacua as a top 10 pick, by all means you should, because there's a lot of reasons that, you know, that's not a bad idea. First off, Puka Nacua last year averaged 18.8 fantasy points per game. That alone was a top 10 wide receiver. But if we look at when he was actually healthy, because remember, he came back on a Thursday night, he didn't even play that many snaps, and he still went for like 100 yards. Well, over his final 8 games, when he got back to a normal snap share, he was averaging 22.2 fantasy points per game. He had 11 targets per game during this time, 105 receiving yards per game. He was an absolute beast during this stretch. He was the wide receiver 2 in fantasy points during that time when he was actually healthy, and he's just been a monster his first 2 years in the league. I mean, when healthy last year, he was pacing for 142 catches. Not 142 targets, 142 catches. The guy's a monster. Now this offense will switch out Cooper Kupp and go to Devontae Adams, who's probably more of a threat overall at this stage in both of their careers, especially when we're talking about the red zone. But this is still Puka Nacua, the guy in the Matt LaFleur, the guy in the Sean McVay offense, who's still going to be the one who gets schemed up. He'll probably get put in motion more. He'll probably get more designed plays. Hopefully we see a little bit more red zone usage than we've seen the first couple of the seasons, but you're getting both volume and efficiency, and that's rare from a guy like Puka Nacua, who led the NFL in yards per out run last year. Yeah, he's my number 14 player, but I'm not going to argue if you say he should be a top 8 player. Now we kick off tier 4 with a couple of running backs. My number 15 overall player, Jonathan Taylor, 16 overall Bucky Irving, and 17 overall Josh Jacobs. Let's start with Jonathan Taylor, who was a top 8 running back in fantasy last year, despite only having 18 receptions. And a lot of this has to do with just having an elite role. He had the second highest snap share at 80% in the NFL last year amongst running backs, and the number 1 opportunity share. Jonathan Taylor saw 88% of his backfield carries and overall targets. What did that amount to? Over 300 carries, 31 targets. Nobody else was really involved in this offense. He averaged over 100 rushing yards per game. He had 12 touchdowns, and this is a guy who actually dealt with injury last year. He dealt with injury that kind of derailed the middle part of his season, but when he got back healthy to end the year, he was winning fantasy championships because over Over those final 3 weeks, the fantasy playoffs and the championship, he averaged over 30 fantasy points per game, and just his rushing yards alone, not even counting his receiving yards, 173 rushing yards during that stretch. Let's also remember the last time that this guy was healthy for a season back in 2021, he was the RB1 overall, putting up 22 fantasy points a game, similar to what Saquon Barkley did last year with the Eagles. And he didn't have any competition last year in the backfield, and that's why he got an 80% snap share and all the opportunities. And this year, the competition, it looks like it's going to be rookie DJ Giddens, who I liked him as a prospect, but we're not going to think that he's going to come in here and see serious work unless Jonathan Taylor was to miss time. So once again, no serious competition for Jonathan Taylor. The offensive line question marks, quarterback situation question marks, but that was the case last year when he was dominating down the stretch for 170 yards a game. Then my number 16 player is Bucky Irving, who I'm not shocked if next year he's going to be a top 10 player because that's how good he was as a rookie. And he really didn't break out until the end of the season, from weeks 12 to 18 when he was the RB3 overall. They came out of the bye week and he took over the backfield and did this. Bucky Irving, over those final 7 games of the season, averaged 18.3 fantasy points per game on, between his rushing and receiving yards, 130 yards per game, 21 touches per game. He was a top 10 running back in everything. Receptions, rushing yards, efficiency, explosive play rating. He was so dominant. Like, some people are comparing him to Devon Achane. Achane is definitely faster, but they're both smaller running backs who are extremely explosive. Now, Bucky Irving is entering his second year, Achane his third year, young backs, right? These are guys who have upside, and I think I see the comparisons, especially short area quickness and explosiveness. And then you factor in that assuming Tristan Wirfs is healthy at some point in that first 4 to 5 weeks of the season, this is a top 5 offensive line for Bucky Irving, who should command the offense in terms of most of the carries this year. I'm liking Bucky. And I'm liking Josh Jacobs, the running back for the Packers. He's my 17th overall player right now. I do think he's worthy of a second round pick. He was a top 10 running back last year, and what happened in the second half of the season when Jordan Love came back from a couple of injuries and the Packers offense started to get rolling? Well, during that stretch over the final 11 games, Josh Jacobs went from only averaging 12 fantasy points per game, as you can see right here on RotoViz on the right side of the screen, all the way up to over 20 fantasy points per game. Now, overall during this time, he was seeing similar amount of touches per game, similar amount of yards per game. He was always producing 100-yard games, right? But the big difference was he started scoring touchdowns. He went from not even 0.2 touchdowns per game to 1.27, started averaging over a touchdown per game those final 11 games. And the big thing was he was unlucky to start the season. Packers running back Josh Jacobs had a league-high 94 yards and 3 touchdowns negated by penalties. Some of those touchdowns came in that first month of the season where he wasn't scoring touchdowns. This was a very consistent player last year. The downsides are he is another year older. We don't know if the Packers offensive line is as elite as it once was. And there's a chance they do skew to pass heavy or a little bit more pass happy this year because Jordan Love is healthier compared to last year where he was hurt week 1 and midseason. So there's no doubt this is not like a bulletproof second round pick, but in terms of the competition, Marshawn Lloyd was supposed to be his biggest competition last year, got hurt. Supposed to be his biggest competition this year, had a groin injury in camp. We'll see what happens there. Other than that, Emmanuel Wilson and Christopher Brooks was the competition last year, and that wasn't much for Josh Jacobs. Now, before we get into this next player in the rankings, so you're probably wondering why I haven't said his name yet, I have to point out one caveat that came to mind when thinking about these wide receivers, and that's on PPR formats like DraftKings Best Ball, they're much more valuable. Like, here's an example. Earlier, we talked about Malik Neighbors as my number 13 overall player, which means I like him at the end of round 1, early round 2. But over on DraftKings, he's currently going as the 9th overall player, a top 10 pick, which you might think for your season-long leagues, I think that's a little bit too early, but in terms of DraftKings Best Ball, it's perfect. And the reason why is DraftKings Best Ball is a PPR format, and you get rewarded bonus points for going over 100 receiving yards in a game for wide receivers. And that's the kind of edge a guy like Malik Neighbors can give you. He's a high-volume wide receiver. We mentioned it earlier. This was a guy who was second in the NFL last season overall right here in targets with 170. If he does this again in a PPR format, especially where you get bonus points for over 100-yard games, that is massive, and it will set you apart from some of the other players who go around him, like a Derrick Henry, who just doesn't have pass-catching upside at all. Now, I've teamed up with DraftKings, and I actually did a live draft just last week. A lot of you were in there, and I took Malik Neighbors at the top of the second round and felt great about it. And if you're not familiar, DraftKings Best Ball is a fantasy game type where you draft your team once, no waivers, no trades, and no setting your lineups. And that's what makes DraftKings Best Ball so much fun. It's the best part of fantasy. You just draft your team, and then you just watch it perform all year. No stress about waivers and setting your lineup. Okay, I just wanted to bring up that caveat because now we're going to get into some more wide receivers here. As you can see, my number 18 overall player, my number 19 overall player, Ladd McConkey, who maybe these guys in some PPR formats or places like DraftKings Best Ball, you start to take over the Josh Jacobs of the world and the Jonathan Taylors, and that's why they're in the same tier because it just depends on your format, your league type, your scoring, all that type of stuff. Now, you might be going, how the heck is Amon-Ra St. Brown 18th? He's like top 10 overall in ADP and all these other rankings. And look, he's been a top 10 wide receiver each of the last 3 years in fantasy, including back-to-back top 5 finishes because all this guy does is produce. Let's just show you how much he produces. Oh yeah, every single season he's going over 100 receptions, as you can see right here. Oh yeah, the last 3 seasons he's averaging over over 1,300 receiving yards and over 19 fantasy points per game. He's just been an absolute beast. So why is he a little lower here than probably what consensus is? Well, he lost his offensive coordinator in Ben Johnson. The Lions offensive line looks like it's going to be worse, and I think that there's just more of a demand for other guys in the offense, like a Jameson Williams taking another step, a Sam Laporta started to come back on towards the end of last year, and Gibbs will probably take another step forward. But that being said, he's just falling into a second round pick for me. I don't think he's like terrible. I just think that spending a top 10 overall pick compared to the other guys, like there's 15, 16 guys who could be first round picks this year. I just prefer those guys instead. Now, a guy I do like and I'm ahead of market on, I believe, is Ladd McConkey, my number 19 overall player, because he was one of the most efficient rookies we've seen in recent memory. And honestly, this guy's breakout like wasn't a fluke. People wanted to carve him out as just a slot wide receiver. He proved that he could be a slot and outside receiver as a rookie for the Chargers last year. Okay, overall, you know, if you're looking at this, that he had over 15 points per game. He was the wide receiver 16 in fantasy points, but that second half of the year or so, week 8 to 18, he became a wide receiver 1 in fantasy, a top 12 overall receiver. In fact, over his last 10 games of the year, while dealing with an injury during this time, he had 17.8 fantasy points per game. He doubled his receiving yards per game from 44, according to RotoViz, to 88 those final 10 games of the season, and he was just dominant. He ended the season with 7 straight games of at least 14 fantasy points. He went into the playoffs and had almost a 200-yard game with a touchdown, the most ever for a rookie wide receiver. Insane production. And now you look at his offense, and like Quentin Johnson, we know what he is at this point, right? He's kind of been a disappointment. Trey Harris, they signed in the second round. If anything, if he's able to come along, well, then Trey Harris, in my opinion, will end up being an outside receiver who can only help Ladd McConkey in the middle of the field, short and intermediate routes. But of course, there was one big addition recently, because the Chargers ended up bringing back their former player in Keenan Allen to a 1-year, $8.5 million deal. And honestly, the salary caps are so high that $8.5 million is probably like a $4 million deal in the past, maybe a $5 million deal. So this is not a lot of money. And it should be pointed out that Keenan Allen did have a good year last year. 70 catches, over 700 yards with the Bears, but that was in an offense that was check down city behind a bad offensive line, and Keenan Allen just happened to benefit. He is now 33 years old, which matters. And in terms of how he's going to impact Ladd McConkey, I don't think he's going to. Like, sure, maybe Ladd McConkey has to get pushed to the outside a little bit more often in 3 wide receiver sets, but like we said earlier, he was already dominating there last year. Keenan Allen, I think, does come in and compete for the wide receiver 2 job. I think he could beat out Quentin Johnson. I wouldn't be shocked, which is kind of sad since Johnson was a first round pick with a lot of expectations. And I think he could maybe beat out Trey Harris, although they're totally different players. There's a real world where it's Ladd McConkey, Trey Harris, and Keenan Allen as your top 3 receivers. But again, this is not Keenan Allen from 2018 with the Chargers. This is Keenan Allen, who's 33 years old now, coming off of a fine year last year, but not the most efficient year. I still believe in Ladd McConkey. What we saw last year is a route runner, a producer, and that chemistry that he had with Justin Herbert, which is why he's a top 20 pick for me. And speaking of top 20 picks, the last player in my top 20, we're going to go into Brock Bowers, who kicks off tier 5, and also my number 21 overall player is another position and a quarterback, my first quarterback, Josh Allen. So Brock Bowers, number 20 overall, Josh Allen, number 21. In terms of Brock Bowers, you don't usually get tight ends going this high, like unless you're Travis Kelce in his prime or Gronk in his prime, and that's why Brock Bowers, he definitely is an exception. Because last season as a rookie, we know that he had 153 targets. 112 receptions was the most not only ever by a rookie tight end, but by a rookie at any position, including wide receiver. 1,200 receiving yards. He ended up being last year the wide receiver 3 in fantasy points per game, mostly because he just didn't score touchdowns. Only had 5 despite having elite volume. There's a world where Brock Bowers could break out for 10 to 12 touchdowns if he keeps seeing this much volume. And look, that's not just great for a rookie, that's great for any tight end. That's why he's currently ranked as a tight end 1 overall in ADP in my rankings, and he's ranked as a top 20 player. He also gets a quarterback upgrade in Geno Smith. He gets a new coaching staff with Pete Carroll and Chip Kelly. There are some downgrades in terms of like a little bit more competition from those secondary wide receivers, Ashton Genty in the short areas of the field. If they are a better offense and a better defense, perhaps they don't have to throw as much in the fourth quarter of games. So there are some downsides. That's why I'm a little bit lower than him being like a top 15 pick in ADP, but still a solid second round pick. And the same could be true right now for Josh Allen, who oftentimes you don't have to spend a second round pick on him. You can get him in the 3rd round, but despite this guy last year going for about 23 fantasy points per game, and he did that despite not even having 4,000 passing yards, because we know he's an elite mobile runner. So much so that he had over 500 rushing yards last year. He had a dozen rushing touchdowns, only behind Jalen Hurts, who had 14, so 2 behind him. He threw 28 passing touchdowns. He's now hit at least 500 rushing yards in 4 out of the last 5 seasons, and he's finished as the quarterback 3 or better as well in fantasy in 5 straight years. Let's pull it up right now. If we pull it up, you can see the last 3 years he's been the quarterback 3 or better. If you go back 2 more years from that, he's just a top 5 quarterback every year. His floor is so safe, and his ceiling is extremely high. The dude has literal league-winning upside. I mean, mean, he has 30 plus fantasy points in 28 games. Like, most times you might get 30 plus fantasy points once or twice from a guy in a season. He's doing it like 4, 5, 6 times a year. It's insane. So you want to get Josh Allen, and you want to get this next running back. But before we get there, make sure you hit the subscribe button. It takes 2 seconds, and it goes a really long way in helping me get even more content out and reaching more people. So 2 seconds of your time, hit that subscribe button. We remain in tier 5 now. My number 22 overall player, Chase Brown, and my number 23 overall player, another quarterback in Lamar Jackson. We'll start with Chase Brown here, who was one of the best value running backs, not only last year as a 10th round pick, but once again as a 3rd round pick this year. He looks awesome because he might be like the Austin Eckler, is what his own coaching staff is saying this year for the Bengals. This is a guy last year, Chase Brown, who took over the second half of the season when Zach Moss went down from injury, and from his rookie year where he only had 44 carries, they trusted him. 229 carries, turns it into 990 rushing yards. He piles on the receptions despite not taking over until the second half of the year. 15 plus receptions, 11 total touchdowns. He was a monster. The second half of the season, he averaged over 20 fantasy points per game and was the RB3 in fantasy points and just never looked back. And heading into this year, his own offensive coordinator has already said that Chase Brown will be one of the focal points of the offense. He said he wants to turn him into a superstar. Think about how like Austin Eckler was in the past for the Chargers. That's how he views Chase Brown this year. So if that's the case, we love it. And after they cut Zach Moss and they only added a 30-year-old Samaje Perine, a 6th round pick in Taj Brooks, there's no competition here. I don't think Chase Brown is one of the best running backs in the NFL. From fantasy though, I think he has a 3-down role. He can catch passes. And we saw what Joe Mixon did in this Bengals offense in his prime. I think Chase Brown can do those exact same things, be a top 10 running back for sure. And I also think Lamar Jackson is somebody in round 3 that you really want to consider, because this guy is maybe the biggest fantasy cheat code that we've seen ever. Because last year he was the quarterback 1 in fantasy, over 25 fantasy points per game. And even if you take out his rushing stats last year and you took out every single quarterback's rushing stats, as a pure passer, he was the quarterback 3. Why? Because he threw 41 touchdowns. He had a career high 4,200 yards. He was an absolute monster, and then he doubled that up with also having 900 rushing yards, with averaging 54 per game, number 1 overall. Only 4 rushing touchdowns. That can obviously come up, but when you're throwing a career high 41 touchdowns, there's not as much to run in the red zone when you're just throwing instead. Basically, we know Lamar's rushing is always going to be there as long as he's healthy. And now if you're going to tell me that in this offense last year, it's just going to continue to pass the ball and he could be efficient there, yeah, this is a brand new level to cheat code Lamar Jackson. And in terms of the passing weapons, yeah, you still have Rashad Bateman comes back on a contract. Zay Flowers entering year 3. They add DeAndre Hopkins, which should help in the red zone. You still have Mark Andrews, a red zone weapon, and Isaiah likely should miss the start of the year with an injury, but he'll come back at some point. So it's the same guys that were there last year, plus DeAndre Hopkins. When Lamar Jackson had a career high year, why not run it back? Okay, now we get into tier 6 and we get my number 24 overall player, and it's Kyren Williams, but this one deserves some attention here because basically at this point, number 24 and like number 30 are so close in my projections. They're like a point apart that this could be a bunch of different guys. This could be AJ Brown. It could be T. Higgins. It could be Jaden Daniels. It could be Trey McBride. It could be Breece Hall. All those guys are basically like the same player in my opinion. So I'll put Kyren Williams head here, and like I could say like, yeah, this was a guy who was a touchdown machine last year, but honestly, I'm not like the biggest Kyren Williams fan. When we get to that range, it really depends on what you need. If you need a tight end, go Trey McBride. If you want to go elite quarterback, go Jaden Daniels. If you want to go running back, it's kind of a coin flip between Kyren Williams and Breece Hall. Right now, I'm a little bit lower on Breece Hall. I like Breece Hall more than Kyren like 2 weeks ago, but recent reports are saying that Braylon Allen is more involved in the offense, and that just worries me a little bit too much for a 2nd round pick. But basically, this is where the tier drop comes. In my opinion, there's 23 players that I really like, and once you get into this next tier from like 24 to 30, they all look very close to me depending on what you want at that position. Depending on how I took my first couple of picks, if I'm going wide receiver, yeah, I like T. Higgins or an AJ Brown. If I want to go running back, sure, I'll take my chances on a Breece Hall or a Kyren Williams. But probably not a Kyren Williams. I'll probably just pivot to a different position. In that round 3, if Chase Brown is already gone, I just like going to elite tight end, quarterback, or a wide receiver. So there you have it. These are my top 24 overall rankings as of right now. Again, these get updated every single week and maybe even more than that depending on the news that comes out during preseason and training camp. If you want to make sure you're getting the most updated version and my top 50 overall rankings completely free, make sure you get that link in the description below, or you head to fantasyrankingsfree.com. So those are the top 24 overall players ranked that'll help you with your first 2 to 3 rounds of your draft. But if you want to see the best pick in every round of your fantasy draft, well, I made this video right here to help you do just that, identifying the best pick in every single round. I think it's going to help you out a ton.